The Gospel of Luke is the story of the persistent widow. It's found in chapter 18 of Luke's Gospel. Sometimes we call it the story of the unjust judge. There is confusion whether we focus on the judge or the widow. It may not be one of the more familiar parables that Jesus tells in his ministry. It is a bit different from the others. The story doesn't really grab me. It doesn't really speak to me until I read it in the context of chapter 17 and chapter 18 in Luke's Gospel. In chapter 17, Jesus is with his disciples, and they ask him that he would increase their faith. And Jesus says to them, this is found in verse 5, "If you have faith the size of a mustard seed, then you can move mountains." In verse 11 of chapter 17, Jesus encounters 10 lepers. He heals each of them of their disease. Against all odds, these 10 are restored, both physically and socially. No longer do they have to be isolated from their families or from anyone else. They can walk down the village streets. They can hug their families. They can be with them. Jesus instructs his disciples as well of the coming kingdom and of the longing that they would have in their hearts for that day to come because of all the misery and suffering around them. And then Jesus says to them, "Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story so that you will see that you should always pray and never give up." This will be my paraphrase of the story, if you will. There was a certain town with a judge who didn't care about God and cared even less about men. And there was in that town a widow who kept coming to this judge, and she said, "Grant me justice against my adversary." Now, already the disciples know something in the story that you and I perhaps wouldn't be aware of. The widow doesn't have a chance. The odds were stacked against her. In those days, widows were given no protection by the law. They had very little standing in the community. No one really cared. And what made it worse was that this judge was both morally and spiritually bankrupt. The widow didn't have a chance. Her plea was falling nearly completely unheard. Well, sure enough, as Jesus tells the story, for some time, the judge paid no attention to this woman. He didn't care. But then the widow became a nuisance to the judge. And finally, the judge said, "Even though I don't fear God, and even though I don't care about people, I'll grant this widow's request, or else she's going to wear me out by coming to me every day and asking me to grant her justice." And then Jesus turns to the disciples and he asks them a question. "Do you hear what the unjust judge is saying?" And then he says to them, "God cares about you more than any unjust judge. He will hear your prayers, but will the Son of Man find any faith when he returns?" And that's the end of the story. We're not told that this widow is a religious person. Surely God grants requests out of love, and not so that we will quit pestering him as the widow was with the judge. And so we're left to ask, what does this story mean, and how are we to understand it? Well, over the years, I've gotten to the place that when I come to this story, I approach it in this manner. I ask myself, what is the story not about? And so let me suggest that the story is not about getting what you want. There's an old Japanese saying that if a sick person makes 1,000 folded paper cranes, then they will be made well. Lots of people believe prayer works that way. If enough people pray, if enough people share their prayers to God, then God is bound to grant their request. It's almost as if we hound God enough, God will answer our prayers. Prayer then is a way of getting God to do what we want God to do. And that's a very mechanical understanding of prayer. If you put X number of prayers in the prayer machine, then you'll get the results that you want. If you don't get the answer you want, then you haven't prayed enough. But that's not what this story is about. The story is not about getting what you want, nor is it a story about good winning out over evil. I think it's easy in this story to take sides with the widow. Who wouldn't take sides with the widow? The odds are stacked against her. We're always for the underdog. But the story doesn't say that she's any better, morally or spiritually, than the judge. The temptation is to make this story say that good will always win out over evil. But you and I know that evil wins many times and good loses many times. Each and every day, thousands of children are starving. Many die of hunger. Innocent people are hurt in their own homes because of the anger of other people. Families are broken by greed and jealousy. Those don't sound much like victories for good over evil. And if we equate the story of one person being good and the other being evil, then I think what we miss is what the story is really about. And so let's say the story is not about good winning out over evil. So what is the story about? Well, let me suggest this. The story is about persistence. It's about persistence. My grandfather always had the habit of asking me every day, Tommy, did you read today's newspaper? And then he would point out an article that he had read and tell me about it and then challenge me to read it. And he developed in me a bit of a habit to read the newspaper every day. That has stuck with me over the years. Well, the story of the widow and the judge is a story of persistence in prayer. In verse 1, Jesus said to his disciples, I want you to know that you should always pray. Well, the disciples could remember all that Jesus had told them earlier about the coming kingdom, the encounter with the 10 lepers, and their despair. They could remember that they asked Jesus for an increased faith, and now Jesus says, always pray. When things are good, pray. When things are bad, pray. When life is difficult, pray. When life is smooth, pray. Let there never be a time in your life that prayer is not part of your daily life. The story calls us to persistence in our prayer lives as well. But I think you and I know that it's so easy to be sidetracked, that we get so busy sometimes that there doesn't seem to be enough time to pray, that sometimes we just forget to stop and pray. Jesus challenges us today with persistence. Prayer has the power to unite our hearts with God, to connect us with God and what God is doing. And that may be why God calls us to be persistent in our prayer life. The whole point of the story, I think, is found in verse 8, when Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth? Not just any faith, but faith that never gives up. Well, it's something for us to think about persistence in our prayer life, persistence in our faith. The story of the widow and the unjust judge. It is a story about persistence, about not giving up, even when it seems that there is no chance, no hope, because God hears when you call out to God. I hope God blesses you today with a smile, with beautiful weather, and with God's presence. Look for God's presence in your life today, and you'll find it. May God bless you, and I look forward to seeing you this Sunday.